So you had impacts on species, impacts on habitat. I mentioned gravel and salmon streams that were disrupted to get gravel for concrete and for building supplies and for roads. Carbon dioxide, and that's obviously in the paper a lot, and again the basis of the fight between some environmentalists. The carbon dioxide footprint of 2010 is horrific. There are ways to actually calculate that. You can calculate it based on a few simple assumptions that are, again, the bare minimum, most conservative assumptions. And so basically you're looking at three areas. You're looking at transportation. How are people going to get here? Are they going to fly here? Are they going to drive here? What are they going to do? You're looking at the construction that generates carbon dioxide. And you're looking at the various events just surrounding having all these extra people come into your town. And when you do that, and there are formulas that allow you to actually calculate based on construction activity, industrial activity, how much carbon dioxide you emit. So it turns out to be using one of the more conservative estimates. It's roughly like 520 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per $1 million of construction activity. That's just a number people have come up with. It may not be the best number, but it's probably the most conservative number. Because that doesn't take into account all the materials you have to make. It doesn't take into account where you get your concrete from and how much rebar you're using and where the steel comes from. All those things tend not to be added in, because if they were all added in, you'd get a vastly larger number. The minimum number, based on the simple calculation, based on estimating air miles and how many people are going to fly short distance, medium distance, long distance, based on all the people going up and down the highway, based on people driving here, based on the security forces tearing around in their Hummers, you basically get a number that is about 3.5 megatons. That's 3.5 million tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, so carbon dioxide is huge. Again, another way to put it in perspective is, of all the countries on the planet, there's 201, something like that, well, the amount of carbon dioxide we put out for the 2010 Games exceeded a city of 1 million people for a year. It exceeded the output of 77 countries on the planet in the same period. So it's not trivial. So one thing I didn't mention is artificial snow. Last year we had a lot of snow, as you know, up in the North Shore Mountains, and in the Callahan. The year before we didn't. There is a problem. Artificial snow can be made in one of several ways, but one of them demands, if you're going to use water, and it's not necessarily water you'd want to drink, you can use wastewater for it, and that's what they usually do, but you need an ambient temperature of -5 degrees. So if you don't have the ambient temperature of -5 degrees, you end up using artificial things. And there's a surfactant called, it's called trisiloxane. Trisiloxane allows you to make ice crystals at fairly warm temperatures, and ice crystals will form around this molecule and precipitate as snow. The only problem is trisiloxane is a pesticide and has been used as a pesticide all over. So imagine trucking in tons of this stuff and covering your ski slopes with it. Well, just down the slope from where I live, it's in the North Shore, there's this salmon thing going on. The wild salmon swim by and just, So you can see how this might not necessarily be a good idea. So when you look at the frames that are real about the Olympics versus the pretend ones, and the part of the pretend one is that the third pillar of Olympism is environmental sustainability, you see that it's not true. The official frame is simply not correct. And what we see time and time again is they don't care. They simply don't care. The government doesn't care. FANUC certainly doesn't care. They got what they wanted. IOC certainly doesn't care. They got what they wanted, or they're going to get what they want. And the problem for me is that a lot of the environmental movement didn't care either. They didn't care enough to go up to Eagle Ridge. They didn't care enough to fight the destruction of the Callahan. They didn't care enough to do all these things. And there are lots of reasons why. So when you think of the Callahan, why didn't more people go up and help at Eagle Ridge? And part of it was because Eagle Ridge protesters isolated themselves by saying, well, we don't really hate the Olympics. We actually love the Olympics. We just want them to be green, and we just don't want you to blow up our mountain. So they were branded as being NIMBYs. So people in East Vancouver said, why should we go up there? They don't care what's happened to us. Why would we possibly go up there? But it was a failure of the environmental movement and people in activist circles to recognize that there was a larger battle that had to be waged, and that even though the people in West Vancouver were fighting it because it was a NIMBY issue, it was still a battle that we should all have been involved in. And because they were isolated, it was easy for the police to go in and haul them away and charge them under injunction laws and basically crush them like bugs. And most of the environmental movement sat quietly. The failure to protect these areas really comes, in some measure, comes back to us. We failed. We failed as a movement to protect these areas. We could have stopped these things. And the fact that we did not stop these things has led to those consequences where we now end up having to fight all these things now as a rearguard action. You can't get Eagle Ridge back. It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. You can't get most of the Callahan back. It's terraformed and carved up, and you might be able to stop the worst stuff to come, but you can't put it back like it was. You can't put back the sea-to-sky highway. You can't put the trees back on Cypress. All these things that you can't undo the carbon dioxide. All these things that didn't have to happen. And the really stunning thing, and this comes up in my conversations with people in the Olympic Resistance Network, that none of us understand is, wait a minute, the anti-poverty groups kind of came together eventually to fight the Olympics. The various native groups came together to fight the Olympics. Different social groups managed to find common cause to deal with all the issues that were there. But why didn't the environmental movement do it? Why couldn't the environmental movement not get their act together to do the analyses and then fight the machine that was coming? I should mention Beijing. Beijing was an environmental catastrophe. You know, they took so much water for their construction, massive construction. By the way, the facilities in Beijing are already falling apart in less than a year later. It took and the bird's nest, like great stadium they built and displaced 500,000 people to do it. Well, they don't know what to do with it, so they're going to tie it into a shopping mall now. So that was the final outcome of that. Beijing spent, the estimate, CBC made an estimate back in the summer, probably about $60 billion in all the extravaganza. It was worse than that. They took so much water from the surrounding countryside that the farmers in the area surrounding Beijing couldn't actually work. They had actually lowered the water table because all the water that was going for construction. So Beijing was ghastly. One thing we can still do is we can still do an environmental assessment, a complete environmental assessment, so that we know exactly how bad 2010 is. Various groups have called for that. A woman up in Whistler named Sarah Jennings has asked various environmental groups to participate, and so she's left trying to do it herself. And so and yet this would be an absolutely essential thing to be able to do, to say, let's actually create that full butcher's bill of what it costs to host these games in our province. How many trees, how much carbon dioxide, how many species at risk, how much overall destruction. And even though we cannot stop it here, we can pay it forward to another city. And we've already partially done that. I've been working with people in Chicago, I worked with people in Tromsø. Chicago was bidding on the 2016 games. Tromsø, Norway is bidding on the 2018 games, and have been told by their bid organizers that everything was just perfect there, just like Vancouver. So I started sending them environmental assessments, and the Tromsø people, with a lot of determination and will, and some of their environmental groups who were not failing their duty, actually did some serious research and actually came up with enough information to actually stop the bid in Norway. And the Chicago group is working very hard to do that same sort of thing. So we can do that. We can contribute to that. We can help other cities evaluate these things from all the perspectives, not only from the environmental perspective, but from the cost perspective, from the social perspective, from the perspective across the board, so that other cities don't have to start at the very bottom like we did in 2002, where we don't know exactly what the numbers are. We're hearing all these claims. We're hearing this Nigerian banking scam stuff. It sounds so good, but it's not. And then if we have that information, then we can actually start really paying it forward to our brothers and sisters around the world, because they're going to be fighting it in 2018 and 2024 and far into the future. Thank you very much.